So this is the first in our conversations arising out of the March 20th, 2020 symposium that was held at Texas A&M, or I guess I should say more accurately, was scheduled to be held at Texas A&M before the COVID-19 pandemic struck. The name of the symposium was ADR's Place in Navigating a Polarized Era. We think that the subject matter of the symposium remains relevant today and probably will remain relevant for the foreseeable future. Today, we are joined by one of the presenters at this symposium, Jen Reynolds, who is professor at University of Oregon School of Law, as well as the director of their center there. She is going to be talking about her article, Talking About Abortion, parentheses, Listening Optional, close parentheses. I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Cynthia Alcon. After Jen has a chance to talk a little bit about her article and some of the key points in the article, we then are going to have a conversation. And one of the reasons we thought it'd be fun for the three of us to be involved in the conversation is that the focus of the article is, as suggested, on listening. And Cynthia has written about and has great interest in empathy and its application in a variety of contexts, including the criminal context. And I have a lot of interest in the procedural justice area, which includes the importance of demonstrating sincere consideration of what somebody said, as in listening. So with that, as a little bit of background, we're going to turn it over to you, Jen, to go ahead and talk with us about what you view as the key points of your article that you want to be sure people know before we engage in our conversation.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And it's, I feel so lucky to be here with the two of you. I was very sad when the symposium got scuttled because of this pandemic, and not least of which because I really wanted to talk about these particular kinds of issues with that particular group that you had put together. It was such a great group. And so this is, this of course is a very special treat to be able to talk with you two about it, two of my favorite people. So, okay, so I think that I'll just talk a little bit about why I came to write this, and then maybe a little about some of the points of the article, and then some questions that I have that I'm trying to build on in my next piece. And then I would love to hear your thoughts and anything that you would want to talk about. Okay, so over the past few years, I'm becoming very interested in public disputing about the kinds of topics, yes, that people are disputing about in public, but also about the way these disputes are taking place. And I, like many others, have been noticing that things are getting very much more all or nothing. People seem to be more angry. People seem very involved and opinionated about a variety of things, and in sort of a take no prisoners, very polarized way. And I think it's a reflection of our times, to be sure. And, it's not only in that our political culture has degraded, which I think it has, but I think it's also a direct result of our reliance on social media as a place to get news, to connect with other people, and often to engage in conflict. And so in an effort to start describing these disputing dynamics, which I find very difficult to untangle and very hard to sort of sort through, I wrote an article called Snap Disputes, which was focused on public disputes that are part of our consciousness, things we have a stake in, things that implicate our values, things that are highly polarized and experienced through media and social media. And then I followed that up with another piece, still trying to think it through. I use my articles as a way to think things through. I don't come to my articles like really knowing anything about what I think. It's, for me, writing is very much a way of processing. But my next article tried to think about how these disputing dynamics may be changing what we think of as appropriate or effective ways to respond in conflict. So if we're constantly looking at conflict spectacles through media, social media, where the winners are getting their way because they're acting badly, because they shout, they bully, they lie, What does that teach us about, what does that teach our society about how do you behave in conflict? And I mean, this is a really important question for us, the three of us and our colleagues, because we teach conflict resolution. We teach lawyers how to engage in conflict resolution and negotiation. Are we teaching them to bully, to shout, and to lie? I mean, if should we be, if those are the ways you succeed in conflict? So it actually tees up a lot of really difficult questions around our own morality and around what it is we're doing in our profession. So in snap disputes, I brought up the issue of listening. So this is when I started thinking about this for the paper that I wrote for the symposium. And my thinking was whether and how we can or should listen in highly polarized debates. I was raised, as probably you two were as well, on the absolute value of listening. That even when someone was spouting nonsense or even vitriol, that you listened, that there was value to listening with the intention to understand. And, not to agree, but to understand. But I think that this esteem that I've been holding listening in and that others have as well, I don't think it's as rock solid as it used to be. I have heard many people in our community and outside our community talk about the pointlessness of listening to people with whom you have fundamental disagreement. And it's not just that it's defended on this idea of not listening is defended on the practical grounds of it's pointless, but also on the grounds of it's going to hurt me or others to listen. So I think it's kind of a pretty deep challenge. And in snap disputes, I wondered how far this kind of exception-based thinking would go. I mean, I could see you saying, I'm not going to listen to your offensive hate speech. But what about a contested issue like abortion? This is something I brought up in that paper. I didn't take up that question. It wasn't really central to the paper, but that's what I focused on for this paper, for the symposium, was abortion. And I actually, one of the disappointments of not having the symposium is I actually wanted to get more views on this particular question. So as I was writing the paper for the symposium, I'm wanting specifically to think about whether or not listening is a strategy you use in the abortion debate as it exists today. I started thinking that about the ways in which listening is both beneficial and harmful. And this gave rise to this idea that I talk about in the paper, the listening dilemma. And so I guess I'll just briefly sketch that out and talk a little bit about how to deal with it, and then we can discuss. But basically, the listening dilemma, it arises when a situation that would benefit from listening on the one hand may get worse from listening on the other. And so we know that conflict situations often improve when you listen, because you're showing respect, because you're learning things you don't know, because you can create the conditions for you to be able to share your own views. So this is all essential to conflict resolution. But we also know that listening can be, or at least can appear to be, risky, because it can portray, or it can give rise to a false equivalency between views. It can be kind of a delay tactic, or can lead to delay that would be harmful. Sometimes people listen or are talking in bad faith. And so is there a point to listening to someone who's behaving in bad faith? And like I said before, sometimes you hear things when you listen that are harmful. So it's a dilemma. And so how do we manage the prongs of this dilemma is the question I end up teeing up for the next paper. But I use the abortion debate as a way to really think about how this dilemma arises, because I think the abortion debate is a very good and illustrative setting for thinking about the challenges inherent in listening, because, and as I point out in the paper, it's a setting that is characterized by a very sort of disorganized and always in flux political and social and cultural setting, right? It's difficult to sort of figure out when and how to engage effectively in the abortion debate. It's obviously something that is highly emotional for many people, implicates more, values and morals for many. And at the same time, it's a place where people are often being very strategic. So, it may be that someone is espousing a view that you would normally want to listen to understand, but they don't even believe it, because actually the reason they're espousing it is because they're trying to either sort of curry political favor from one party, or they're trying to demonstrate their political partisan affinities or whatever it is. And so in those particular cases, it seems like listening doesn't have the same sort of value add that it would in a situation where we might be having like a real heart-to-heart conversation. So I mentioned at the end, and then I'll stop, that I think that what we need to be thinking about when it comes to highly polarized debates like the abortion debate and our sort of field's commitment to listening, and I believe it is a commitment, and I believe it is a moral commitment, is that we don't listen the same way all the time. We take into account things like context, what are the features of the situation, who are the people who are involved, what roles are we playing, when is this happening, these sorts of context features. And we also take into account our goals. So it's, I think that we need to be listening, I think needs to be retained as one of our essential conflict resolution practices. But it's not a dogma. And it's not something that we just do kind of in an unthinking and reflexive way, that it's going to be informed by our understanding of what's going on and what it is we intend to do with our listening. So I know that that's part of the paper that I didn't develop as much. That was part of what I wanted the symposium for, to help me sort of think through that piece. So I'm grateful for this conversation today. Anyway, so that's where I am, and that's what I was doing.
That's fabulous. Thanks very much. And I have to say, I think that the idea of the listening dilemma is brilliant. The idea of kind of using the negotiator's dilemma, where the focus is on the danger of providing information, and then using that as the template to say that there also is a listening dilemma. I just think it's brilliant.
Oh, well, thank you.
So let me maybe first turn, Cynthia, do you want to start the conversation?
Sure.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love this, and I find it, it's such an important conversation for us to be having in the field, to be thinking critically about some of the, I think, philosophical underpinnings that we haven't questioned as a field as much as we should, right? And I think that your paper really brings it forward, right, in terms of thinking about what are the things we need to not just accept as you said, it as a dogma, right, as a truth, right? That there are things that we need to examine a little bit more deeply. I think you both know I tend to be on the side of skepticism. I think there are conflicts that are intractable, that we can't fix, that any amount of process is not going to fix them. And I think your paper really pulls this out, right, in a lot of ways, and really pulls out the and grapples with, and I think you've got, space to continue grappling with this question of, because I think what underlies it is this idea that if we just listen enough, we can resolve these conflicts, right? And as you rightly point out in different ways in the paper, no, that's not true. And I think one of the things that is really challenging as we're thinking about how to deal not only with our current political reality, but just in general in the field, is the reality that, unlike what I think our field is premised on, which is the idea that everyone really at root has the same interest to resolve conflict, right? I don't think everyone does. There are conflicts that people that work to people's advantages in different ways, and you kind of pull this out in the abortion debate. There are those that continuing to keep this as a live issue works for some people, right? Not coming to some resolution on a political level and on the political front works for some people, right? We don't all share a common interest always of wanting to resolve conflict, and that I think we have to look at some of the conflicts that we have in our society and in our world, and really take a cold, hard, honest look at that fact. And what does that mean then? What do we do if we're confronted with a situation where, this is the point of intractable conflict, is the interests are in conflict, right? And if the underlying interest of resolving the conflict is in conflict, right, that doesn't exist. That's hugely challenging. And I do think that this is part of the difficulty that we have in a lot of the conversations that we're having in the here and now. Continuing to have active points of conflict works to the interests of some in a variety of areas. And so it does then force us to ask the question about, when and where and how are we listening? And I think, the one that you've said about that, clearly if someone's using hate speech and being hateful, we don't feel the need to. I think that one, yeah, absolutely, I agree. I don't need to understand why you're hateful. I don't need to understand where your prejudice comes from. I don't agree with it, and I don't want to come. And the point, unless I'm a therapist and I'm trying to get them to move to another place, that's not really the point in a lot of the areas where I might interact with that kind of speech. But I think it becomes much more of a challenge when we're dealing with these intractable political conflicts in our society right now, where we have to figure out more what's going on. Do people really not want to come to resolution? Is it really just a win-lose? Like the only possible thing it's not about procedural justice, right? I mean, we all believe and liken this idea of procedural justice, that if we put the right procedure in place, people can live with losing, right? But is one of the ideas coming out of that. But yeah, I think we've seen with abortion, those that are, the pro-life, or if we want to, whatever term we want to throw on it, after Roe v. Wade, that they didn't go away and say, okay, well, we've had a good, fair process. That's the end of that. No, it's in many ways gotten much harder since then in terms of how we talk about or don't talk about, and listening, I don't think is a big part of that. I mean, I don't know about your Facebook feeds. Mine are full right now of stories of people who've had late-term abortions. Mm. And they're compelling, really emotional, challenging stories, none of which fit the narrative of the traditional pro-life person makes it appear as if the late-term abortion is something that only happens because, the woman has, waited too long and been thoughtless, and, just completely ignoring the reality that most late-term abortions are because of serious health issues. But I don't think any of the things in my feed are getting read by people on the pro-life side of it.
And I'll just quickly say thank you so much for those comments. I two things. One is it's really instructive to know to point out that our social media feeds are all different. And I think that another thing that our field needs to grapple with, and just our society, is that we are all getting different information all the time. If we go to, I just saw this on that Social Dilemma on the Netflix. If you and I both go to Google and type in a question, we will get different search results. Yeah. And because it's trying to give us some sort of tailored whatever, and it's disturbing. It's not what I would think was happening. I really expected that I would see when I have to do Twitter for my new role here, and I hadn't done it before. And I guess I didn't realize that I'd be seeing this kind of curated, I don't even know like how they put together what it is they think it is I want to see, but it's distressing because it makes me feel like it's harder to listen because it's harder to even know what the other views look like, like what they actually are. So that's one quick thing. And the other is, with respect to the abortion debate, I bring this up briefly in the paper, but one of the things I was thinking about as I wrote was that this has been going on a really long time, this particular debate. And I can remember in high school having my best friend and I just talking for hours because she was anti-abortion and I was not pro-abortion, but pro-abortion rights. And but we were really engaged in what I would think of as like a real conversation about it. It's it was not a caricature. We really talked about it, and I feel like the issues have been very hashed out. So I think that part of the challenge for listening in this debate is that so much has already been said, that it's already, that's why I feel like some people are making things up, sort of trying to create new information to sort of try to like about the late term abortions or like about post birth abortions. I mean, these things are, I think, just meant to try to add an extra layer of information onto a completely traveled ground. And so it ends up being one of the challenges of this particular debate.
It's interesting you talk about the social media feeds being, or the Google searches being tailored to us. And that absolutely is creating an echo chamber, right?
Yeah.
Where your views are not being challenged at all. Instead, they're being affirmed and nurtured. And in a way, the fact that the three of us are involved in dispute resolution and in education, education is supposed to be a setting in which you are learning things or confronted with information or perspectives that allow you to grow and learn, which is inconsistent with an echo chamber.
That's right.
So earlier, Jen, when you were describing where the place of listening in the future in our field, I think is really important. And it was interesting to me that you distinguished between maintaining a moral commitment to listening, but at the same time, no longer having it be a dogma. It's an interesting distinction that you're drawing there, because in some ways, as I read your paper, I found myself thinking or wondering whether you were actually suggesting not just that we let go of listening in terms of dogma, but potentially also, in a sense, let go of listening even as a moral commitment. And let me just say that a lot of this depends too on whether we're imagining the listener being somebody who's involved in the dispute, as would be true with abortion, right? Or whether we're imagining the listener being somebody who's been identified within society as somebody who's supposed to be a third party, and we are giving them the responsibility for listening because we're acknowledging we cannot do it anymore, or there's not a need for us to do it anymore. And I think that one of the confusions as well within our field is, who are we focusing on? Are we focusing on the parties in dispute, or are we focusing on the third party who's been given this societal role, not just to decide, but also to listen, which is, I think, sort of important. I'm just going to say one more thing, because I also, I'm in reading your article, which I'm so grateful that it's part of the symposium. In reading your article, I also found myself thinking that it fits into what seems to me to be something that's happening with, I'm going to call, the more junior scholars, sort of the mid-level scholars. And that is sort of disaggregating things within our field. I mean, I think about like Donna Shostowski's work, where she's breaking down processes into their elements, right? And she's saying, rather than focusing on the process, focus on individual elements and which of those elements are important to people. This is not a junior colleague, but Roy Lewicki, who says to us, trust is not this monolithic thing. There's interpersonal trust, there's more instrumental trust, there's professional, there's different types of trust. And I think it's really useful that you are suggesting here, more than suggesting, really affirming for us, that listening, even though when I use that word, I immediately think of empathic listening. I think of the best form of listening, right? Or what I would call the best form of listening. But that there actually are so many different gradations of listening based and what you listen for based on what your goals are. And I think that's really important. And I'm not sure that the most sort of instrumental sort of listening, listening so I know how best to get what I want from you.
Right.
I'm not sure that's totally consistent with a moral commitment to listening, because it's an instrumental use of listening. And I also thought it was really helpful in your paper, as you talk about context, the different interactions within the abortion debate, the different relationships that exist between people that then can influence what listening means. So I feel like one of the really important things you're doing here, besides the really brilliant thing of identifying the listening dilemma, is also forcing us to break down what exactly listening is and its different component parts. That anyway, I'll leave it right there for right now. I have other stuff I want to talk about with you in connection with this, but I'd be interested in your thoughts in response to that.
So I think you are right that instrumental listening. So I'm listening so that I can debate you or figure out what makes you tick so that I can manipulate you.
Yeah.
Certainly is a form of listening because it is, in some ways it's a form of empathy because, you know, you're sort of seeing where someone's coming from, you're seeing what makes that person tick. And it's just being used in like a way that we would think of as selfish or interested. And so that's maybe not moral. And so I think I take your point there. I think that might be something I want to explore further. I think in general, the reason why I'm returning to the idea of listening as a moral commitment, and I'm not sure exactly how to understand that. I feel like it's something I feel, it's something I believe, and I think it has something to do with a certain set of beliefs I have around human nature and society, and the way I think it should be. Part of that was, I think, really driven by, there was a story, I think I may have referenced it in one of my footnotes. There's a group of counties in Oregon who are trying to become counties of Idaho.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, because they don't like the blue of Oregon, which is Oregon, when it votes, it ends up being we have like a super majority in our state legislature of Democrats, and very liberal place for the most part. But then there are these places that don't feel, and they don't feel listened to, I think, as a matter of the representative democracy. And their answer is to want to be part of a different state. And I remember when I heard that, I found that so disturbing, that the answer would be not to continue to try to engage or not to try to build bridges, but actually to try to build a border or a boundary or a division. And that seems to me to be kind of a common trope, and it's exacerbated by our social media creating the echo chambers that we find ourselves in. And it makes it seem like, when I hear about people who believe these conspiracy theories about the Satan worshiping, blood drinking, Hollywood stars, all I can think of is that we must be like two different, completely on different planets. Like, it doesn't seem like we could be people who could get along. And then at the same time, I go to the dog park and my dog is romping around and somebody else's dog is romping around. And it turns out, that we sort of share this love of dogs, and we may or may not share, that sometimes people are, supporters of a different political candidate that I might be a supporter of. But yet we do have these sort of commonalities. It's a reminder to me of, I don't know. So the dog park to me, so I have these two different images in my mind. I have this seceding from Oregon image, and then I have this dog park image, and these sort of places where people have decided they can no longer live together, and these places where people are able to interact socially and with community and happiness. And I think about what it is that makes, how do we keep from becoming a very divided society into more of an integrated but maybe pluralistic one? And it seems to me like the only way is through a commitment to this sort of interaction. So in that respect, I think that that's where this moral commitment to listening is coming from. It's not that it's not that you're going to listen the same way, or maybe even at all, depending on the circumstance. But I think when you choose not to listen, I feel like that should be a big deal to you. Like, it should be something that is significant in your mind, that you're making a choice and that you should review and be ready to adjust.
Yeah. No, so one of the other things in your article that I thought was really interesting was this idea of actually, I don't think it was in this article. I think it was in a different article, the conflict spectacles or conflict performances. It's really interesting to think about, and you so frequently reference literature in your articles. It's interesting to think about. Are there any instances? I'm sitting here thinking, can I think of any instances where the refusal to listen, whether it's in a movie or a book or a television show, the refusal to listen had these significant consequences, so that the conflict performance would be about the importance of actually listening, of not refusing to listen. I'm sitting here thinking, truthfully, maybe I could think of the Hunger Games as being an example of how a nation went down because it refused to listen to those who felt oppressed by that nation. But I wouldn't say that's the main takeaway that most people have gotten from the Hunger Games.
Oh, no, that's interesting. As you were speaking, the first thing I thought of was the vice presidential debate that was recently on. I don't know if you all watched that, but it was definitely the refusal to listen in terms of the questions. I was really surprised at how in so many instances there was not even a pretense made of answering the question that was asked, but just saying something else completely. And I don't know that was correlated with, or that was shown to have caused some bad outcome. Although I do think it's causing a bad outcome, that we have this sort of frustrating disconnect between what our leaders say and the questions that we ask them. I think that's that disconnect is really problematic. But yeah, I have to think further about examples from literature about people refusing to listen. I think that could be a really good little study.
It's just very interesting, the idea of these conflict performances, because using the vice presidential debate as an example, the question is whether either of the candidates suffered, not whether we suffer. That's actually not the question, right? It's whether the candidates suffer. And and when you talked about these conflict performances and the behavior that leads to people winning on Survivor, I found myself thinking about Shakespeare's morality plays, or about the stained glass windows that were in churches that were illustrating the biblical stories that the church really wanted to be sure that the plebeians were aware of.
Right.
I think it's very interesting whether or not there are these conflict performances or spectacles that are sending the message that maybe we hope could be sent. Now, I've spoken way too much, Cynthia.
Yeah, so a few thoughts. One on this idea of, are there stories? I think it's a basic comedic device, isn't it, that people fail to hear? They fail to listen. There's a miscommunication, and then something ensues that really didn't need to happen. I think that's going on in situation comedies all the time, right? And so they aren't big morality plays, right? It's we aren't talking about something at that level. But I think that the whole concept that failing to communicate well and listening has negative impact certainly is out there. I think in a lot of comedy. I think it's a piece of a lot of the comedy out there, but not the larger societal impact. I think on the debate front, it's really quite interesting. We've all learned the term the pivot, right? That's what you're taught to do, to pivot, right, away from the question that's been asked to what they want to talk about, and that this is considered to be kind of standard good political politician behavior, right? And one of the things I read coming out of the vice presidential debate was a columnist, and I can't remember who, was saying that a number of people were complaining about how boring the vice presidential debate was. You know, the most interesting thing was that fly, right? It was so boring. And the columnist was saying, yeah, that's what political debates are supposed to be. They're supposed to be boring. We're not supposed to have, you know, high drama happening in when our politicians debate each other. They're supposed to be talking about wonky policy things, and it's supposed to be, you know, it's not supposed to be reality TV. And I think, you know, that is one of the questions, like at what level do we expect our discourse to be high drama? And does that create part of the problem of listening, right? If everything's going to be these high dramatic conflicts, well, you know, listening isn't a big part of how you make that happen, right? In fact, it's the opposite of how you make that happen. And so I think you know, a piece of it also is just, what are we getting conditioned to? What are we expecting? You know, I think it goes beyond social media. I mean, I've probably had this conversation with both of you at some point, but I think reality TV in and of itself, it just created changes in how we look at things and talk about things in this country. I mean, as you both know, I've lived abroad for a good number of years. And when I first left to go work in Eastern Europe, it was right before the first Survivor started. Mm-hmm. And when I came back, I mean, there were all these references I didn't understand because, of course, you know, I wasn't watching it and I didn't know. But I really think, you know, it created this kind of an entertainment that I don't think we'd had a lot of, where people really liked watching people fail. Right? Where something, you know, and people really liked the conflict, you know, voting someone off the island, and, you know, which is kind of a version of what the Oregon counties are doing, right? They're going to vote themselves off that island. But, you know, it almost kind of brings a credibility to the conflict, and that we live our lives in conflict. That somehow is fun, right? Instead of something that we should be concerned about and think about how do we, you know, I think it's kind of telling that we don't have a reality TV where we bring everyone together in a house and we try and make everyone a better person, right? You know, Big Brother, that's not what that was, right? Or is, I think it's still on, right? Survivor, that's not what it is. It's not about how can we help everyone to succeed, right? If everyone gets to stay on the island, if everyone does well, you know, then we're all going to get a prize at the end, you know, if we help. That's not how any of this stuff is premised. And so, you know, it's really the winner take all kind of idea, which doesn't help when we're talking about political discourse, if that's where we bring it to. But I wanted to bring it around to what we do, which is teaching law students. Because I think one of the question about listening as an instrumental thing, and the reality is in law school, in different ways, in different places, we teach that. Trial ad is all about listening in an instrumental way, right? If you're going to do good cross-examination, you better listen well to the direct, right? Your closing argument is all about listening during trial and pulling out the pieces that you're going to be able to weave your story together in the closing argument based on what you've heard during the trial, right? And we emphasize that that's good lawyering, right? We're using, you know, our listening skills in ways that help our clients. We certainly, you know, I teach it in negotiation. You need to listen. You need to understand where the other side's coming from. And one big reason is so you can get what you want for your client, right? There is an instrumental aspect to it. And I think I want to question a little bit the conclusion that it's not moral to have it be instrumental, right? Because if we do value the role of lawyers in this society and the fact that we do have a representational function, right, that we do have clients and clients' interests that we need to represent, I don't think there's anything immoral at all about listening in an instrumental way. In fact, I think you are failing to do your job as a lawyer in a lot of instances if you fail to do that, right? You know, it's a different question if we're talking about what's a mediator's role or the role of a neutral, and what's a judge's role. And I think we've got serious questions, particularly at the appellate level, and we're seeing really serious questions at the Supreme Court process in terms of what our appellate level courts are hearing and what they recognize about their role of being a neutral. And their claimed neutrality. I found that quite interesting in our latest round of talks, that this claim of neutrality that, I question,
Mhm.
because I think at that level, I think it becomes a fiction, right? I mean, no one's really that, a Supreme Court justice is not a neutral. They've got a series of life experiences that are influencing how they're making their decisions. And we need to be honest about that. But, going back to the question about listening and the instrumental part of listening. And I think the challenge becomes, and I think this is, what's so fun about what you're writing about, is breaking it down, right? And asking us to think more critically and more analytically about what we're doing when we're listening, and where, when, and how it's appropriate for whatever the goal may be, and where, when, and how it may be something that we need to say is less so. So.
So interesting. First, I will offer that some reality programming is positive. I'll just give as an example, Queer Eye, if you ever have watched that, has an incredible, it's not a competition. It's not a competition show, but it has an incredible focus on empowerment and on listening. So I was just making myself a note that I might want to look at that further. So obviously listening is a very useful skill if you're doing trial ad and if you're being a lawyer, and I think that's true. And I don't know that kind of listening necessarily is immoral. It's like, I don't think it's an immoral thing to do, to listen strategically. Indeed, if you came up with an agreement that the other person was happy with because it took their interests into account, it seems like you've done something of use, even if you weren't motivated by trying to meet their interests. So, there's something that you've done that's of value, that's not sort of socially unvaluable. I think that we have as you were speaking, Cynthia, I was thinking about, I had a conversation with an ombudsperson, and she was really upset because it wasn't our ombudsperson here. It was a different one. Very upset because she felt like part of her job had become empathetic listening to people who were experiencing what basically were the effects of institutionalized systemic racism at the organization. And that her job, she was saying, felt like a way to shield the institution from making changes by helping people work through their individual experiences and come to feel better about it, or at least feel like they'd vented. And this is something that I worry about for our field just generally, that one of the things that we create when we valorize empathetic listening is we create these little off-ramps for people, who might otherwise be kind of compelled to do something collectively to make change. We create these little places for them to preserve the status quo, because we help them get away from the stress of what they're experiencing by taking it on. And so this is something that I think mediators often have to sort of grapple with, and certainly ombuds people definitely have to grapple with. And then the question becomes, that empathetic listening is like the gold standard of listening, that beautiful, hearing where they're coming from and really reflecting back that you acknowledge it. But it sort of raises the question, is it moral if it's being done so that the racism, the oppression, whatever it is, can continue?
I think it's a question that we as lawyers face. It's beyond just our field.
Yeah.
When I first started practicing law, I was a public defender in LA right after the 3 strikes law started in California. And a whole lot of guys, mostly guys, were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison on very minor new offenses. Someone stole a pizza, someone stole a pair of jeans. I had clients who had possession of 1 rock of cocaine who got sentenced to 25 to life in prison. And one of the things that I felt at the time, and that a lot of us talked about in the public defender's office, was we were enabling the continuation of this bad law. It took over 20 years for the law to be rewritten so that the new offense had to be serious and or violent. That it couldn't be a rock of cocaine or stealing a piece of pizza to get 25 to life. And part of what was going on is defense lawyers were doing what they do, which is they were doing their damnedest to represent their clients. And as a result, it took pressure off the system. And my feeling at the time is if all of these guys had gone pro per, had represented themselves, the system would have shut down. It wouldn't have been able to deal with it. And it would have forced change much more quickly. And there would have been a whole generation of men who wouldn't have served such a long period of time in prison. And so,
if there'd been no plea bargaining.
No, but it's not even that. I mean, I think it's all of the lawyering that lawyers do, because a lot of those cases went to trial.
Okay.
Some of them pled out, but a lot of them went to trial, but they went to trial efficiently. You know, public defenders know how to try a case, and they know how not to make a bunch of frivolous motions, right? So if you've ever watched a pro per in a criminal case in court, it makes like the judges crazy, right? Because they take so much time. There is nothing quick about a pro per. It is the longest way to do litigation, right? And it's so painful for everyone in the room because you've got someone in the room who's just, you know, who knows they don't want to have what's likely to happen, and they're just going to do everything they can think of, right? They throw the kitchen sink at it, right? Which means there's nothing efficient about a pro per handling a case. And if all of these cases that had gone to trial that were handled fairly efficiently by public defenders in the state of California had instead been handled by pro pers, the court system would have just clogged up. And it would have forced plea deals in cases where they weren't, because in the early days in a lot of counties, LA County DA's position was, no, we're not going to offer anything on these cases. It's a third strike, no deal.
Wow. Given what you just said, Cynthia, and also what you said earlier, Jen, I mean, I again find myself thinking that, you're not, I'll be surprised if, as you move forward with this, if you continue to describe a moral commitment to listening. I mean, I think this conversation seems to me to be one where we all agree listening is a good skill. It's a good and useful skill. But it's how it's used and for what purpose that determines whether it's moral or not.
I think that's true.
And you know, Cynthia's point about there being sort of different types of morality. I mean, there's professional morality. There are ethics that are particularly applicable to lawyers and other fiduciaries that wouldn't be applicable in other settings. But again, your paper is really, really interesting to me, in part because in the procedural justice literature, which is mostly focusing, not entirely, but mostly focusing on that third party who's making a decision. Again, not only, but mostly. For the third party, it's really important that the third party listen, right? That's part of their morality because of the role they're in. I mean, and interestingly, I believe that in England, the trials and the idea that you would listen to a person on trial, I think that actually was a practice that was either introduced or espoused by the Catholic Church. So the idea of allowing someone to be heard and listening to them rather than using one of these other means of determining their guilt, you know, had a moral grounding. I think I'm right about that history, but I'm not positive. But at this point, if we're not just talking about judges or a jury, we're talking about people actually involved in the dispute. I'm not sure that listening is necessarily always representative of a moral commitment. I don't know.
All right. Well, I've written myself down a little note that this is going to be one of my upcoming projects. Is the morality of listening itself. Is it a moral thing, or is listening just something a moral person would do or not do, or do in one way or not another way, depending on the situation?
Skill, and it turns out to have use.
Yeah, that's right.
And has the potential to be.
That the immoral or the moral could use.
Yeah.
For moral or immoral ends.
So one of the thoughts that came to me as you were speaking, Nancy, was about restorative justice, and some of the critiques and criticisms of restorative justice. So, those who are proponents of restorative justice love the idea that everyone gets to be heard, right? In ways that in the traditional criminal process
Yeah.
they don't.
Yeah.
Both victims get to be heard in ways they would never be heard in the traditional process, and as do offenders. But some of the critiques, and there's a Canadian scholar, Annalise Acorn, you might want to just, if you haven't read her stuff. But anyway, I can't recall if she really talks about it in terms of listening, but she does talk about it in terms of why should someone have to sit in a room with someone who's done them wrong and hear anything from them, right? And she really raises this very serious question of why are we asking people to do this in restorative justice? Shouldn't we have a system where people don't have to do that? Which of course is our traditional legal system, right? They don't have to. But I think it's an interesting question, right? Because it does go to some of these questions about where, when, and how do we want to be listening to each other, right? Under what circumstances do we want to ask people, and towards what end, right? If we're most concerned about the offender, well then, restorative justice probably does help them. But if our primary concern is the victim, well, there's plenty of stuff that says victims like this, but there's also plenty of victims who probably don't and won't and may feel pressured. And then do they have to listen to someone talk about why they did whatever they did that hurt them? I mean, so I do think there's a lot of interesting questions about where, when, and how we're asking people to listen in spaces that aren't necessarily like that we recognize as being the point of conflict, right? In terms of like political conflicts or whatever.
That's really interesting. Well, one thing I wrote down, I don't know if this counts as a final, this isn't going to conclude anything, but I just wrote it down, so I guess I'll just mention it. I wrote down the word vulnerability because I was thinking when Cynthia was talking, I was thinking that when we have a society that is so premised on fighting and on watching fights for entertainment through reality TV or through movies or whatever, or watching fights in the political realm and, seeing people like draw blood and they want it to be dramatic and exciting. Mm-hmm. It seems like the challenge to listening in such an environment is profound because to listen in the way that's not instrumental, in the bad instrumental way, but to listen with a desire to understand and with a desire to show respect and a desire to learn, that puts you in a vulnerable position. And I don't think I've thought enough about how part of the challenge for people today is it's both that they don't have these cross-cutting opportunities because they're in the echo chambers, and certainly they see spectacles around them of fighting. Mm-hmm. People might not know how to listen in an authentic way in a time like this. It may seem really dangerous. And maybe this is just the prong of the listening dilemma that I identified of, it seems harmful. But I guess one thing I would like to be thinking about more, and maybe in our field we could talk about more if people are interested, is how we update what we teach now around listening from being about active listening, which I think is really useful stuff to teach, to addressing some of these more complicated questions around setting context, goals, types of listening, and the self, the questions of morality, vulnerability, self-protection, extending yourself. I mean, just things that sort of maybe let the students and us explore more about what we think we risk losing when we engage in what we would think of as an enlightened conflict management strategy, that involves listening. So other than that, I mean, I've had so many ideas as a result of this talk. I'm so grateful. And I am really happy that you all put this symposium together, that we had this chance for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been wonderful, wonderful conversation. Looking forward to continuing it, perhaps in a non-recorded setting.
Fingers crossed. We want to be done with this. So.
All right. Thanks very much, Jen. Really appreciate it. And Cynthia, thank you as well. It's been a wonderful conversation.